Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Controlling Labor. Let's look at the issues and topics that we want to discuss. First, we'll talk about how progressives and middle-class managers tamed business from the inside. Then we'll talk about how business and labor itself, not just the government, tamed labor, and how labor bought into the hegemony of the capitalist system and the progressive middle class, with some modifications. Let's look at how middle-class management tamed business from the inside. There was a managerial revolution that accompanied the rise of the corporate form. We see this managerial revolution begin in the railroads of the 1840s, in which technical managers replaced entrepreneurs and owners in day-to-day operations. Owners separated themselves from management by buying into the company via the stock market, and this made owners interact with the board of directors and the company president rather than acting as day-to-day managers as had pertained prior to the coming of the railroads and prior to the rise of the corporate form. Managers, for their part, had to be educated to their jobs either via apprenticeship or on-the-job training or through formal schooling. Systematic management arose as part of this managerial revolution, and we also see the rise of the engineer, both as a technical expert and as an appendage of management. Let's look at the factory structure and how work took place. Even after the rise of the giant corporation, particularly in manufacturing and on the railroads, we see that shop floor control began with the workers. That is, for a long period of time, foremen would be contracted to do a set of tasks. This was particularly true in heavy manufacturing and in the iron and steel industry. And then this foreman would go out and contract with other workers. Sometimes he went to the local saloon if this was in town, and he might hire a crew of various kinds of workers at various wage rates through this so-called shape-up system. Other skilled workers tended to be able to control the shop floor as well as these foremen did through contracting themselves, work through work rules and work traditions. This is to say that skilled workers, in addition to foremen, had their own ways of controlling the workflow and the work floor. There was a shift to management control during the progressive era, and this began with Taylorism, a system of industrial engineering, and the whole profession of industrial engineering was born with Frederick Winslow Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, published in 1911, and you see Taylor here in the image to your right. The idea that Taylor had in his system of scientific management was to increase efficiency and productivity in a manner that came to be called Taylorism. Taylorism had a great impact on management. Taylor designed workflows and he designed machines. This gave management the tools they needed to break down and understand even the most complex traditional and skilled worker output. And this allowed managers to then take control of work processes, learn the jobs, and then seize the work processes and the knowledge of the work processes from the workers themselves. Another thing that Taylor introduced was the concept of piece rates. He introduced these in 1895 as a part of a system to raise efficiency of workers by paying them per item that they made rather than for their time or for a set of tasks. This generally lowered the amount that workers received and increased the amount of time that they had to devote to creating products. Time and motion studies captured work processes so that they could be shifted to management. Management could analyze these work processes and redesign them as well. At the same time, personnel departments arose within the organizational structure of businesses. These centralized control of production, hiring, and payroll under the hand of managers rather than foremen. Management reliance on personnel departments ebbed between World War I and the New Deal, in a period when federal government reduced its oversight and unions were particularly weak. Let's talk now about the battle for the mind of workers. Workers during the Progressive Era, and prior to that during the Gilded Age, had brought this new thing, this labor union, to the fore of industrial organization. The point of the labor union was to do for labor what corporations did for capital, organize individuals into a larger group. Unions provided workers with benefits that companies and society did not provide, such as sick benefits, assistance in unemployment, steady work using the SHAPA, retention of work rules that benefited workers, which is a thing that most managers complain about even today, and a voice in decision making rather than merely exit as the strategy of making change. Management had new tools that combated labor unions, though labor unions became part of this system of industrialization. Management still never really liked labor unions, and one of the tools that they used was welfare capitalism to get rid of unions or to suck the life out of a union, to make it redundant. The idea of welfare capitalism was that the system I'm about to explain to you was controlled by managers and made labor a junior partner in industrialism. Progressive firms took on more responsibilities for worker welfare. This reduced turnover. It reduced union participation because the loyalty was then transferred to the boss. And in large part, it made more productive and happier workers. What are we talking about when we're talking about welfare capitalism? What kinds of programs did welfare capitalist companies create during the Progressive Era? They would, for example, hire doctors and offer health benefits. Companies provided recreational facilities and activities to their workers. They tended to provide better housing if they wanted their workers to stay longer, and eventually some companies provided profit sharing. A good example of all of these is TCI, Tennessee Coal and Iron of Birmingham, that was bought by U.S. Steel in 1908. TCI sent a new foreman, a guy named Crawford, down to Birmingham to see if he couldn't take control of the TCI plants. One of the things that TCI suffered from was extraordinary levels of absenteeism and extraordinary levels of turnover. Not necessarily extraordinary for industrialization and the era of industrialization, but extraordinary for the bottom line of the company. Crawford wanted to get control of this absenteeism and turnover. Turnover rates were 300%, 400%, and 500% per annum, and absenteeism was 50% per day. That is to say, they had to hire double the number of workers to make sure that a shift was covered, because half the workers would lay out. Workers did not like the factory discipline. They didn't like going to work every day and doing the same thing, particularly if it was a dangerous job. Frequently, workers, even if they had families with them, would work for a number of days until they got the amount of money that they wanted. Then they'd lay out for a few days. So what did TCI and Crawford implement? They proposed and implemented pension plans. They improved plant cleanliness. They provided safety training. They provided an accident relief plan. This is like workman's compensation before there was workman's compensation. They hired a few doctors and a number of social workers. They provided model company villages. They provided company schools and community activities. A company union replaced the worker-controlled union, and this happened as a result of welfare capitalism. Leadership was co-opted as well. Worker leaders like Samuel Gompers of the AFL joined the National Civic Federation that was formed in 1900 to unite business and union leaders. They worked toward an understanding, a partnership, and arbitration rather than striking. Samuel Gompers, like I said before, was not only a member of the National Civic Federation, but he became its first vice president and held that office for many, many years. National Civic Federation was a hedge against socialism and radical unionism. Now, if co-option didn't work, coercion was part of the toolkit. And this was coercion by business and the middle-class infrastructure. The National Association of Manufacturers, for example, was a lobbying group and a trade association of manufacturing concerns that had not necessarily formed into trusts. It had an extremely conservative agenda, and it was very pro-big business. It was also very anti-labor, and at one time or another attacked many unions in court. During strikes, it aided and encouraged so-called citizens committees to use vigilante methods to break the strikes. In addition, strike breaking became a business. Many detective agencies, like the Pinkertons, formed specifically to strong-arm strikers. Some businesses developed in order to recruit and provide strike breakers. And large circulation newspapers, which were often the voice of the middle class and the upper middle class, argued that businesses should treat workers better, but workers had no real right to strike and picket, or even to organize like capital had. The federal courts and the federal administration weighed in. In 1902, there was a coal strike in the anthracite regions of Pennsylvania. This strike threatened to shut down coal production during the winter months, and the union wanted arbitration of the issues at hand, but the managers and the owners refused arbitration and acted in a manner that many people thought was a little bit overly arrogant. This coal strike developed the new concept of the quote-unquote public interest. The role of government in this strike made it no longer a strike breaker, but a peacemaker in labor management disputes. This was a change from siding with the companies alone. Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time, and his goal was to promote the public interest in the face of the hardships caused by this dispute. The Bureau of Labor, prior to TR intervening, did a fact-finding tour and fact-finding hearings. What came out of this was that the operators were arrogant, especially George Baer, who wrote a so-called divine right letter to Theodore Roosevelt that made the public angry at the operators, but not at the workers. The result was engineered by J.P. Morgan, that the Anthracite Coal Commission was formed and heard both sides, then issued a report. Again, TR introduced this new angle, the public interest, by choosing to gather facts by being relatively neutral. And then he identified the public as consumers whose interests he identified as being in the goods produced, not the fight between labor and capital. Now, this is a profound step toward the consumer economy that we are participating in today. Another way that the federal government weighed in was in the Danbury Hatters case of 1908 that was decided in 1915. The Hatters Union struck the low hattery in 1902 and organized a secondary boycott. That is, the union asked other people not to buy these products. Low won a judgment outlawing secondary boycotts of this kind. And in 1915, Low won compensatory damages against the union for the 1902 boycott. Now, this was a real shocker because in 1902, just suppressing the secondary boycott really took a tool out of unions' hands. But then making a system of law that allowed the working men and women and the union itself to be sued in court for compensation could potentially break unions' finances and destroy unions, and they could also go after individual workers who had been ringleaders. The federal government did continue after Roosevelt to send troops to put down strikes. An example of this is the Ludlow Massacre of 1914. Federal troops did not create the massacre. After mine owners failed to put down a strike, they called upon the governor of Colorado, which is where Ludlow is, to send in National Guard troops who rampaged through the strikers' camp, shooting 13 and burning to death 13 women and children. 13 were shot, 13 burned to death. Miners armed themselves for a war and called in reinforcements. Some National Guardsmen almost mutinied. They did not want to be sent in to put down this continuing strike. But President Wilson mobilized local soldiers, both the National Guard and the U.S. Army, the news of which quelled the strike in favor of the owners without further talks between owners and workers. So Wilson continued the policies that had existed prior to Theodore Roosevelt's intervention in the 1902 strike, which was to send in troops in favor of owners. Now, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, also participated in controlling labor, in having labor buy into the hegemony of this consumer's market, of this consumer identity, of this middle class life. Having more was an identifier in American society. More was also a political position, part of the desire of the AFL to have workers recognized as citizens, not just as components of business. More and the AFL and a new economic theory called marginal utility defined economic problems as due to underconsumption. So if workers had more, they could consume more and become more a part of America. This concept of more, promoted by the AFL, defined the new role for labor in modern U.S. capitalism. Labor would no longer be anti-capitalist, it would no longer be mutualist, but it would be a partner in an ongoing enterprise that provided the workers with the ability to participate in the consumer economy and the higher-minded body politic. So let me summarize. The progressive era middle class not only disciplined big business, but also the working class. They did this by creating a business infrastructure that centralized power in the hands of managers rather than owners or workers. Managers often ameliorated the problems that workers faced, an example of which is welfare capitalism, and they co-opted labor leadership. But managers and their supporters in the general populace did not fear coercing workers to accept workplace arrangements. The federal government weighed in different ways. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt sided with workers in the anthracite strike, but strengthened the identification of the middle class as disinterested consumers rather than as participants in labor struggles. The Supreme Court's Danbury-Hatters case stymied one of labor's most effective tools to pressure employers to recognize unions, the secondary boycott. This, too, defined labor as an opponent of consumers. Roosevelt was an aberration, as President Wilson proved when he sent the Army to quell a strike in the Ludlow fields of Colorado that blatantly supported the owners' refusal to deal in good faith. Finally, workers in the labor movement began to identify with this newly arising consumer society. The new economic theory of marginal utility opened the door to analyzing constant economic downturns as a result of underconsumption, which argued for higher wages for workers so they could consume more. Labor leaders, particularly the AFL's Samuel Gompers, argued that workers in the early 20th century did not really want to overthrow the capitalist political economy. They just wanted their fair share of the rewards of that economy. Workers wanted more. This then is the end of the lecture. I hope I left you wanting more as well. As always, thanks for your attention.